Hi, everyone. This is Holly Pivec here with Doug Geivett. This is a special episode of my podcast because we wanted to address the apology letter by Francis Chan that he has put out, along with another letter from the elders with his organization. The title of his letter is Tremble at His Words, Be Careful with Your Own, a public apology for careless words I have spoken. It's a letter that was released on March 6, 2026. And it is published at the Crazy Love Ministries website. And we thought it was important to address this letter. So Doug, he is currently on his boat in the Everglades. And so that is why we are doing this special episode as audio only, because his internet access is very patchy right now, but we thought it was important enough to address this public apology. So we wanted to make it happen, even though we couldn't do video this time. Doug, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, it's great to be on with you again, Holly. And I am sorry that this is limited to audio only, but I think that this is such a timely and topical issue. We had reflections about this that we shared with each other and felt that the sooner we could address this, the better. And of course, there are other people who've had things to say about this letter, probably some favorable and others not so favorable. But we have our own thoughts about it that are part of the general concerns we have about the New Apostolic Reformation and the contemporary prophetic movement that he addresses directly in some cases and indirectly in others in this letter. And as you mentioned, not only does he speak for himself in this letter that he wrote, but the elders of his organization, other leadership that works closely with him, wrote a letter of support for what he was saying and affirmation of his comments. And we'll probably have things to say about both of these documents that were published together.
I actually grew up hearing Francis Chan. He was the featured speaker at Hume Lake Christian camps in California and in the Sierra Nevadas there in California. So I would listen to him give messages there and appreciated that, as I think I was a junior higher at the time, maybe a high schooler as well. He would be there multiple summers, as I recall, speaking. And I think even one of my good friends actually responded to one of his messages and gave her life to Christ. And so I grew up with an appreciation for Francis Chan's teaching. But then over the years, as I was researching this New Apostolic Reformation movement, I became concerned about an increasing association and affiliation with leaders in the New Apostolic Reformation movement. I wanted to mention that by way of background because I know a lot of people really have an appreciation for Francis Chan, for his books, for his speaking, and a lot of people, I don't think, who haven't kept up with the New Apostolic Reformation, who don't really know about it, aren't really aware of just how deeply enmeshed he was becoming with leaders in this movement. In an article we wrote called The Implosion of IHOPKC that's published at my blog at hollypivec.com, we wrote about Francis Chan, and we noted that before the scandal broke at IHOPKC, Chan spoke at IHOPKC multiple times, acknowledging that he had been warned by many people not to accept the invitations because Bickle is, quote, creepy, unquote. Those were warnings he ridiculed while he was on stage at IHOPKC. He also gushed about his love for Bickle in front of thousands of young people and praised Bickle's, quote, humility, unquote, and love for Jesus. And he apologized to Bickle and other influential NAR leaders, including Bill Johnson, for ever thinking he needed to correct their theology. Shockingly, he suggested that anyone who criticizes Christian leaders, including Mike Bickle, is a, quote, divisive person, unquote, and may be struck dead by God. I would say that this goes beyond just speaking some careless words to much more than that. But what would you say, Doug?
Yeah, well, I think so too. But I also think that the way he frames this otherwise is problematic, and these things all fit together as concerns. He says early on that this is prompted in part by the fact that he has been receiving requests from other people to respond to allegations, and some of them very well substantiated allegations of scandals happening in the lives and ministries of people that he has affirmed, supported, and praised publicly over the past years. But the way he puts it is interesting. So the first point to note is that this letter seems to be prompted, given his own wording here, by a concern that he's receiving more and more requests from people who follow his ministry to respond to these allegations that are being made, and maybe say something in response to concerns that he has overpraised so many people that are now in the spotlight and faced with serious challenges, both about their own integrity and about the fruit of their ministry. So I think that is part of it. I think he's feeling some pressure here and some heat from others who know that he has a history of supporting people who are now exposed, you could say, and rightly so, for legitimate problems. And he's not denying that these problems are legitimate. He's acknowledging that they're very real. And he is also acknowledging that he has commended these people. He's getting requests from people who know this about him and about what's happening with this exposure, to say something now about what he's done in the past in support and how he's going to proceed in the future. But one thing that he says here is very interesting early on in his letter is that he's responding to these requests that come from so many other people right now, responding to new exposure of, and he puts it this way, quote, those who no longer walk in integrity. And I'm already concerned by this language, because he says these are those who no longer walk in integrity. And it entails, in fact, that there was a time in which the people that he has supported, that he has affirmed, that he has praised publicly, were walking in integrity at the time and are now no longer walking in integrity. Now, if that was the issue, I don't think he would have a serious problem here, because an individual might be right to commend the character or the teaching of someone who then fails in a very serious way and has to withdraw his support. But this isn't the case here. This simply is not the case. And I know this isn't the case because the only name he actually mentions to illustrate his point is Mike Bickle. And Mike Bickle's ministry, his public ministry with IHOP Kansas City, began during a time when he was already lacking in integrity. And I would say this integrity was a problem for Mike Bickle on two levels. And the one that gets the most attention would be the scandals surrounding his behavior with women, some of them who were minors at the time. And that is scandalous, and it is painful to hear. And it has been damaging to those people who were directly affected and their families, but also the broader church. But those things, it's now known, are things that Bickle was involved in from the beginning of his public ministry that has become so celebrated and so well known until recent years. So there isn't a question of whether this was a man who had integrity at a time, and at that time, people who recognized his integrity and respected him properly for it were commending him, and now they've got to go and rescind their earlier affirmations, not because they were mistaken then, but because this person has fallen and is no longer a person of integrity. That's not what happened. Bickle was already lacking in integrity, and it's only recently that it's become so well known, and it's pushed people now, like Samuel Storms, now here Francis Chan, and others who say, well, we didn't know. But not knowing that Mike Bickle was doing these things is not the same thing as saying that at the time that they affirmed him, he was indeed a man of integrity. Now, his integrity does not go only to his behavior with other people, but it goes to Bickle's behavior as a prophet in the contemporary church, and claiming to be a prophet, whether directly or indirectly. You recall, Holly, that we interviewed with Mike Bickle a number of years ago. We sat down with him at his ministry office there in Kansas City. And the first question we asked him was whether he believed that there are apostles and prophets today. And he said, well, sure, emphatically, yes. And I asked him, well, then do you consider yourself to be a prophet or an apostle? And he said, no. I then asked, well, can you give us examples of people that you would consider to be apostles since you think that they do exist today? And he said he couldn't name any. Now, I didn't believe him then. And of course, now we have evidence that really supports the deception, the claim that this is deception that took place. Because if you'll recall from that discussion we had, we began to quote to him some prophecies that he had already made, and then he had to backpedal and try to explain how those did not qualify as prophecies after all. But now we know that he was telling young women that he was working with in ministry from the early days, that he had received prophetic utterances from God pertaining to his own marriage, to the future he would have with these women individually. And he purported to have apostolic or prophetic authority for making these kinds of claims, and it was intimidating to these people. That was spiritual abuse. And in my view, the spiritual abuse started before the sexual abuse started. And the sexual abuse that occurred later is an extension of the spiritual abuse and the false teaching. And I am concerned that in the church today, people will be distracted by the obvious abuse at the level of public scandal, especially in the area of sexuality, and neglect to consider how that is intimately connected with false doctrine. And my view of this is that if you claim to speak for God as a prophet or an apostle, and you have that kind of authority that trumps the authority of others, and it's false, then you are already engaged in such a fundamental deception that you are capable of anything. And what Mike Bickle was capable of came out later, but it had been happening for a couple of decades, I guess. So I just don't accept this way of framing things by Francis Chan, as if he's discovered subsequent to his affirmations, when his support for Mike Bickle was legitimate, that Mike Bickle later abandoned his integrity. It's not clear that he ever had any integrity. And these close friends of his should have been in a position to know this. Now, here's what's interesting about this. When it comes to sexual sin, that can be hidden for a period of time. It's not public. Somehow it becomes public if the individuals involved begin to speak up and they express, they talk about their victimization, as has happened in this case. But you can understand how one Christian leader might not know that another Christian leader is engaged in such things and is committing adultery, is breaking the law, and is violating individuals and their own purity of life directly. Those things could be happening and nobody knows it, is what I'm saying, or nobody except the participants know. But when it comes to prophecy and biblical teaching that is actually a distortion of Scripture, you don't have to wait for sexual scandal to know that there's a problem with integrity, because these prophets do not actually offer compelling evidence that they are prophets in the first place, and yet people listen to them and believe them. And it's scandalous only after some sin is exposed. But the sin of misrepresenting God as purported self-proclaimed prophets and apostles predates all of this and is so public that most people should be able to discern it, and certainly people with 40 years of ministry, 30 years of ministry experience, 20 years or 10 years of ministry experience, being in the spotlight themselves, teaching the Word of God, being intimately acquainted with Scripture, as Francis Chan is supposed to be. They have no excuse for not discerning this lack of integrity from the very beginning. And so I think that he's framed this in this way, in part because it helps to excuse his permission and his permissive attitude towards false teachers, because it only later came out that they were guilty of these other scandalous things. And yet this isn't even entirely consistent, because he's talking about Mike Bickle by name. And Mike Bickle is a clear case of an individual who was not a man of integrity, even from the beginning of his most public work in ministry.
I appreciate that you brought up the part where he says these are leaders who no longer walk in integrity. I actually had that underlined in my copy too. And then he goes on to say, I have watched hundreds of leaders fall over my 40 years of ministry. Each time it feels like a kick in the stomach. Years of immorality are uncovered, false prophecies are exposed, or greed is brought to light. And the thing is, though, as you said, it's not just the sexual immorality. It's not just that they had some wrong prophecies. It's not just greed. He doesn't really acknowledge throughout his whole letter, seriously acknowledge the issue of false teaching. Did you catch that?
Yeah, I agree with you, Holly. I mean, he does mention, as you quoted there, that some prophecies have proven to be false. But see, I think there's false teaching about prophecy in the prophetic movement today. And I think it's false teaching that Francis Chan himself accepts. I mean, on the evidence, it looks like he does accept it. One thing that he says to explain his actions in the past is in sort of praising certain leaders within this sector of the church is that he was shaped spiritually in his early Christian life within a context where people were hypercritical for trivial things. And this was cause for disunity within the church. He's never specific. He doesn't say what these are. And I don't know what to make of that, because if they're very trivial, they might be things like Christians who fight over the color of the carpet in church or whether drums can be played for worship music or whatever. I would like to know what are the most egregious cases of disagreement among Christians that have caused disunity, stemming back to Francis Chan's only early Christian formation, so that we had a context for this shift that he later deliberately adopted to be more welcoming, more ecumenical, more pluralistic, and willing to endorse and support and praise individuals whose ministry activity has been subject to scrutiny and criticized pretty profoundly on biblical grounds over a course of years. I don't understand how that's justification, that in your early spiritual formation as a Christian, you were exposed to a lot of silly backbiting or disagreement, and how that's supposed to mean now you should swing the pendulum in this other extreme direction. That's a metaphor that he himself uses. He needs to explain why the pendulum swung at all. And for that, he'd have to be more specific about what he's reacting against and why that led him to embrace this more crazy love posture that is his hallmark and the name of his ministry, in fact, so that he's much more warm and receptive, and apparently without being very discerning. To have hundreds of people or even dozens of cases where leaders proved not to be trustworthy after all should tell you about your powers of discernment and what got you there in the first place. And I think he doesn't do that kind of self-examination. But I think here's one reason why, and it is because, as he mentions in part of the letter, he's wanted to find space for prophetic ministry in the church and the prophetic movement. He became sympathetic with the prophetic movement personally on some level and thought that people who lead within that movement, broadly speaking, need to have a platform, need to be given an opportunity to build their ministries without criticism. And we can see that it's without criticism because Chan has no experience challenging or criticizing anybody within the prophetic ministry, as you might expect, where that is most needed. That kind of discernment is especially needed when people claim to be prophets. So your discernment skills should be sharper than ever when it comes to things like this. And it seems to me that he was just casual about discernment because he wanted to find space in the church today for prophetic ministry. Now, that's not to say that he is NAR, but I think that his sympathies with NAR people are so substantial that it's reasonable to suspect that he is himself NAR. And you might, on close inspection, see that indeed he does endorse NAR types of teachings. But the point I'm simply making here is that he was motivated to be ultra gracious towards people in prophetic ministry because he had enough sympathetic concern for the ministry or the movement, the prophetic movement, to defend these people and defend them within the broader evangelical church. In other words, he wanted to help them gain a platform and establish respectability within the broader evangelical church, when it's an open question whether or not what they're doing is even a matter of integrity in the first place, as you and I have been exploring for several years with the publication of 4 books on the New Apostolic Reformation.
Speaking to his lack of discernment, he makes some interesting comments in his statement. He says, for example, but if I were to make public statements every time I was wrong about someone I once trusted, sadly, it would be a very, very long list. And then he says, a little later, he says, some assume that I don't speak about these people because I'm embarrassed to admit I was deceived by them. That's really not an issue for me. I publicly admit I have been fooled hundreds of times in my life. I have wrongly trusted many leaders. Hopefully I will become wiser, but I will still make mistakes. I mean, I think that's an astounding admission to say that, you know, he's been fooled hundreds of times in his life, and the list would be very, very long of leaders he once trusted, but found out later that was mistaken. I mean, I don't, what do you think about that? I mean, I don't.
It's stunning, Holly.
I don't want to say my list wouldn't be that long, but I don't think my list would be that long.
Right. Well, yes, it is a stunning lack of discernment. It is a stunning admission. And it isn't just that he has been deceived, but because he has held these people up as worthy of admiration, as responsible teachers and ministry leaders, he has been a part of the deception. He has led people to believe things that are simply false. And he realizes in some cases, he should never have believed them himself. And he says, now, here's the thing, it's going to happen again. Well, I don't know why it needs to happen ever or why it needs to happen at all. And to have a track record, admitting that I have a track record of falling for deception and then deceiving others, though he never quite accepts that language for what he's done, but then leading other people to believe the same deception. Right? His witness has been false. His witness has been false, and that follows officially, logically, from his claim that he believed false things and then shared them with other people without qualification. This is a disqualifier from leadership, to be honest with you. And I don't know why he's not more concerned than he is. He says he's embarrassed. But embarrassment isn't really the right posture here. Even humility isn't really the key operative thing here. What's needed is a recognition that I have failed in my vocation as a minister of the gospel, and I have led people down a path of falsehood. And he's still protecting himself in this by identifying only one individual by name. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that, as I recall from reading it a couple of times, there's only one person he names as an example of a person who lost his integrity, and now I need to, apologize. And that is Mike Bickle. We've already talked about that. But he says there's all these other people. Well, I would like to know at least who are some of these other people. He doesn't want to name names. I think that there's an effort to protect himself. Maybe he still has a relationship. Maybe he still respects some of these people. And why now? Why is it now that largely the Mike Bickle debacle has quieted down, but new things have cropped up, having to do with Sean Boltz, having to do with the prophet Chris Valentin at Bethel Church and the apostle Bill Johnson, other leaders, but these are really the most recent ones. And it's in the middle of this recent exposure that we've been talking about and others have been talking about that Chan decides it's time for me to step up and issue an apology. But the only person he talks about, even though there are many, many, many at least dozens, if not hundreds, that he could name, is some case that's now largely history, and it's totally safe to say, I was wrong about Mike Bickle, because everybody now realizes they were wrong about Mike Bickle. Samuel Storms, who claims to have been one of Mike Bickle's most intimate friends and has written books defending the prophetic movement and talking about how to be discerning with respect to prophets, was totally lacking in discernment with respect to Mike Bickle and did not apply adequate criteria for determining his authenticity as a prophet. So his books are not satisfactory. His very well, highly celebrated publications defending prophecy as an example do not give us the biblical criteria for evaluating prophets that we should all accept and that Storms himself should have accepted. And had he accepted, would have provided him and the people he has influenced in the decades since from the deception of Mike Bickle. And the same thing can be said of Francis Chan here. These men they praise the prophetic movement. They defend the prophetic movement. They want it to continue and to be platformed. But now it's in total disarray because they don't know who they can hold up today as a legitimate prophet who that they will not have to apologize for tomorrow. And that's because they don't understand the criteria for prophetic authenticity. And yet they're the ones that are celebrating and promoting it so vigorously. And none of that is acknowledged in what Francis Chan has to say in this public letter of apology.
And then he talks about in this letter about, the reasons. He gives some reasons. Well, people have asked him, why haven't you spoken out sooner? And, when all of these scandals have now come to light, why haven't you made some kind of public statement sooner? And there are a number of reasons given in his letter. And he talks about, for one thing, because of the internet. He says that that reminds me a little bit of what Chris Vallotton was talking about.
I thought the same general idea while you're identifying the quote there is that with social media now being the means by which so much teaching, including my own and yours, gets passed along to other people, you lose a little bit more of the control over what is heard by whom, and context is lost. And people view many of the teachers that they respect through their podcast or their publishing ministry. They view them almost as if they're their pastors or their seminary professors. And I don't really see why you need to make excuses by blaming social media and the internet here. You just need to be responsible in your speech and discerning and realize that your voice may well be heard throughout the world and probably beyond your own lifetime if you have any significant influence as time goes on. So none of these things make sense to me. I don't understand when Chris Vallotton says, we don't consider ourselves to be the pastor of a person who lives on the other side of the world, when they are deliberately promoting a global movement, and he calls it our movement. The Bethel Church movement is our movement, according to Chris Vallotton, and it's a movement that they wish to make global. And so I think they have worked very hard to become the apostles and prophets and, in effect, the pastors of these people that they never meet, and they're using social media in order to do that. And then he excuses the failures at times on the very methodology that they have deliberately adopted for that purpose. And I think Francis Chan is a good example. He has a platform that he's exploited that includes the internet. And it's not just somebody else is quoting him. He's promoting what he believes and who he supports using this medium. And if it's such a dangerous medium, in his opinion, then I think he should probably leave the medium altogether and do something that he considers to be more responsible, where he can control the results in a different way. But he's probably not intending to do that.
Here's what he says exactly. He says, I have been at this for a long time, in the age before the internet and social media. When a leader was caught in unrepentant sin, it was assumed that those who previously had endorsed him or her no longer stood by those statements in light of the new information. Only in recent years has it become the expectation that everyone who ever publicly affirms someone as a brother or sister must publicly denounce them if they fall. I just want to stop there for a second. I want to talk about how he downplays his close involvement and defense and promotion of these leaders. And that's one example. He says, only in recent years has it become the expectation that anyone who ever publicly affirmed someone as a brother or sister, he did much more than ever once publicly affirming these NAR leaders as merely as being brothers or sisters. He did much more than that. He vigorously defended them, promoted them. So he downplays that there. But then he goes on to say, for the sake of clarity, please know that, of course, I do not continue to endorse people like Mike Bickle who have been caught in unrepentant immorality. But if I were to make public statements every time I was wrong about someone I once trusted, sadly, it would be a very, very long list. That's where the context where he made that statement. And then he says, I understand that some people see it as apathetic or irresponsible to refrain from commenting on these situations. But I would ask you to consider that after issues have been disclosed about someone, there may be some of us who remain silent, not because we don't care, but because we believe there's already too much focus and discussion about these people. I've seen leaders get pressured by others to say things that God may not be leading them to say. I have fallen into this trap as well. Again, I believe it is important and necessary for scandals to be exposed publicly. I just don't see a biblical mandate for everyone to weigh in on them. Well, I would say that Francis Chan, of all people, needed to weigh in, on these issues, given his long history of involvement and promotion of these leaders. But did you have any thoughts about all that?
Yeah, well, Francis Chan needs to think about, I would say, a person in his position needs to think about how people listening to those words, hearing those words, reading those words, might interpret them and say and nuance what he has to say in light of likely judgments people will make about it. And one of the most likely is it sounds like an excuse to remain silent rather than a principled ground for remaining silent. He can call it a principled ground, but he hasn't really given a good argument that there are principled grounds for remaining silent when you have been so gushing and eloquent and profuse in your support in the past. And you can't just issue a wide, a sweeping statement of apology in general terms and do justice to the damage that has been wrought by the teaching and the influence that you have. So I don't buy it. I'm not influenced by it. And I think that rather than assign, motives to him that would require a knowledge of his heart that I don't have, I'm not doing that. I'm simply saying that in his position, he should, you would expect him to be aware of how people would understand his words. And I'm giving you an example of how what he says might be taken. And it would be very natural to take it that way. Mike Bickle is a safe target now. And Francis Chan waited a couple years until the coals have cooled about Mike Bickle, and new coals are burning white hot about individuals closely associated with Bethel Church today. And it's now that he begins to come out and talk about this. The timing it doesn't make sense. It's like, well, what you said about Mike Bickle, you could have said 2 years ago. And now you're saying it? And why aren't you talking about others when you say there are so many others? Let's talk, at least weigh in on those cases where you have linked arms with individuals and you now have reason to warn the church. It isn't enough to say, well, other people are doing it. I don't need to do it. And another problem here, you alluded to earlier, Holly, we were explicit about it, but it needs to be said in this context as well. Francis Chan, like Sam Storms, were very critical of people who were raising alarms, expressing concerns, and appealing to Scripture in their expression of concerns about Mike Bickle and others. And they excoriated the critics. They did it in very strong, I think, terms that were almost an abuse of power. I know this person. You're absolutely wrong. There's no way this person is like this. Or you misunderstand the Scriptures or whatever. And they just denounced critics. I don't see an apology from either of these fellows to those critics who show discernment and are models of discernment and should be examples to these men themselves about how to be discerning going forward. They should be holding those people up with the same kind of admiration that they showed for people who are now being exposed for false teaching. And I'm not hearing any of that at all. And it's because they are so intent on protecting the prophetic movement almost no matter what the cost, until the cost is so great that it starts to affect their own ministries, their own reputations personally, and then they simply have to say something, and they come out with something that is inadequate.
Yeah, and I mentioned that he makes a number of statements, and the elders do. We can address the elder statement next. It's called a statement from the network elders of We Are Church. But they make a number of statements that downplay, as you said, his gushing, endorsement and promotion of these NAR leaders. They imply that, well, he doesn't necessarily have perfect discernment. Well, his discernment was far from perfect. And then also,
the reason why he says that, Holly, the reason why he says that he lacks perfect discernment is because it's a safe statement. Nobody has perfect discernment. He knows that, and he expects those who read these words to know it too. So what's the point in saying it? The question is whether he is discerning enough to qualify as a mature leader of believers in a world of confusion. And if what he really means is that I haven't shown proper discernment, not perfect discernment, I haven't shown proper discernment, then that's what he needs to say, and not let the claim that he's not perfect be a substitute for what is really the case, that his discernment has not been adequate, it has not been proper. You don't have to be perfect for it to be adequate. And you don't need to give an apology in public if it is adequate, even though it's not perfect. And yet he is giving an apology.
Well, in the statement about perfect discernment, that's actually in the elders' statement, and it's in a section called Our Perspective on Francis's Character. And it goes on to talk about what they can say with confidence about Francis's character, that it says Francis loves Jesus in his day-to-day life as much, if not more, as he does publicly. Francis seeks to walk in humility and is open to correction. He has regularly reflected on his own mistakes and strives to align his teaching and actions with Scripture. One of Francis's strengths and sometimes weaknesses is that he trusts people and sees the best in them. Well, that's what they were Bill Johnson, and they were saying about Bill Johnson in his apology, right? That one of his flaws is that he sees the best. He tries to see the best in people. That's kind of like if you're doing a job interview and you're not supposed to say what your weakness is, so you take a strength and act like it's a weakness or something. I mean, but then
how
he
are
trusts
you
people
seeing the
too
best
much.
in someone? And how did he see? It wasn't seeing the best in these people. That's why he has to apologize, is because what he thought was true about them proved to be false. And that was not seeing the best of them. It was seeing something that was not true about them. So now here's another it's a very conspicuous irony in the response by these elders, these leaders whose own letter of affirmation of Francis Chan is published together with Chan's own letter, is they're doing the same thing that got Chan into trouble. They are trumpeting Chan's virtues in much the same way that Chan trumpeted the virtues of Mike Bickle and who knows whom else. You never know who that is from the letter that Chan writes, but there are apparently many, many, many such people. We have to be very careful when we do that. They're doing the same thing that Chan is saying got me into trouble. And who's to say that it won't get them into trouble later on if it turns out they don't know Francis Chan as well as they think they do. Now, this is not me saying anything about Francis Chan's character here on this point. I'm not saying they are going to discover to their chagrin that they stretched it a little bit thin to affirm him in the way they do. No, I'm sure they have great confidence in him and they know him personally, and I don't. So I don't begrudge them that. But the problem is that Francis Chan basically has already pulled the rug out from under their intentions to do that by apologizing for having done the very thing they're doing and getting it wrong with so many leaders that he thought were pure as the wind-driven snow and God's own prophets and apostles. So probably the best response to Francis Chan's letter, if you wanted to affirm what he was doing, would be to be careful not to do what he was apologizing for having done with other people.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You actually beat me to my point, which was the same thing, that they have this long list of praising, his character, that he loves Jesus so much. And like you said, they know him better than we do. And that very well is all true. But it is the same thing, as you said, that if I had $1 for everyone who told me prior to the exposure of Mike Bickle that, Mike Bickle is such a humble guy. He drives a simple car. He lives a simple lifestyle, as if driving a simple was proof of his character. But yeah, the same thing. And then it goes on, though, in the list, in their list of talking about his character, it says, despite being burned many times through circumstances that would lead many people to drift towards skepticism and distrust, he authentically maintains optimism and faith in a way that seems supernatural. And then it goes on to say, integrity does not mean perfection, and definitely not perfect discernment. A sincere man can still be deceived. So that's where the elders made the statement, acknowledging that he wasn't, his discernment wasn't perfectly. But it says, but we have not seen duplicity in Francis's life. And so that's where that statement came in. In the elders' statement, they said, people did warn about his theology and said he was part of the New Apostolic Reformation. But it said right on IHOPKC's website that they denied being part of the New Apostolic Reformation. Well, how many times, Doug, did you and I do interviews where we said, yes, it says on their website that they deny being part of this and they deny these beliefs, but these are the reasons why this statement is misleading, and these are the reasons why they are still part of this movement, even though they deny it. And they say that they sought out many leaders outside of the elders sought out leaders outside of the charismatic movement to get their perspective on IHOP. And they said, IHOPKC, and they said, well, these leaders said, oh, there's some minor theological differences, but nothing too serious. Well, they didn't seek us out. If they were wondering if he was part of this New Apostolic Reformation movement, you think they would have gone beyond just reading a denial on their website, on the IHOPKC website, and maybe would have come to us or other people who, have written entire books about this movement and have addressed IHOPKC's involvement with this movement many, many times.
What you're suggesting here, Holly, is good. It suggests that we should be more curious than we are when things come up along this way. We should be more curious about what the conditions are for authorizing someone as a legitimate prophet or an apostle or a person of character than we are. We give them we're so willing to just use almost no criteria and no judgment, no critical reflection in making really substantive theological and practical decisions about ministry and doctrine and the truth and so forth. And the only time we really care about it is when it all starts to go sideways and it turns into a train wreck. So why are we waiting for something to become a train wreck before we start thinking about, should we have gotten on this caboose in the first place? So I think that's the issue here. Giving Francis Chan the benefit of the doubt here, I think the challenge should be, well, what's next? Can you help us understand better what you think are the kinds of principles and criteria to use in discernment so that this doesn't happen again? I mean, why? Prophecy is supposed to be action guiding. It's supposed to change the way we think about the world. It's supposed to influence our beliefs, our values. True prophecy from God is supposed to help us in our decision making and plan our futures and all that. But it's only legitimate for us to respond to prophecy in those ways if that prophecy is truly from God. And if we can't know that until it's too late and we find out, well, this prophet had no business making those statements, then what good is it? I mean, ultimately, all of this means that we aren't using legitimate criteria for testing prophetic claims and so alleged apostolic authority on the front end like we should. This wasn't a problem for the apostles of Christ. This wasn't a problem for the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul is a great example of one who made a very energetic and compelling case for his own apostolic authority. And he's a leader. He's an exemplar to anyone who purports to be an apostle or a prophet. They should be doing the same thing, and the church should be holding their feet to the fire. Paul was willing for the Bereans to test his own teachings against their knowledge of Scripture. The prophets today, in effect, they generally disdain that. They don't want you to use your own judgment. They want you to believe what the mass of people believes or what other leaders in the church believe about them. And so people just easily assume that they have authority when they have a responsibility to test it. One of my biggest concerns here in this discussion we're having, Holly, is not just about people like Francis Chan, Sam Storms, they clearly are sympathetic with the prophetic movement and they want to protect it. And it's cringeworthy when they are energetically pushing it. That's part of their agenda for the church. And then all these problems, these explode in their faces, and they have to figure out, well, now, how do we control the damage? But what I'm concerned about are people in our churches, pastors, Sunday school teachers, elders, or our seminaries, people who teach Old Testament, New Testament, theology, Christian apologetics, philosophy, like I did in the seminary. They should all be speaking out today and saying, here is my assessment on biblical grounds of today's prophetic movement. And all we get is crickets. And this is a disservice to the church because clearly the prophetic movement has caused incredible myopia on the popular level. And no pastor today in any evangelical church can be sure that he doesn't have a significant population within his church that is confused by this and needs to get biblical guidance. And so I'm calling for people in those positions, seminary profs, Christian educators, anybody who has, a big influence on the church, and certainly pastors whose responsibility is to equip the people for the work of the ministry. You cannot ignore the prophetic movement today. You must speak up and you must say what it is that you believe. And if you're not sure what you believe yet, that doesn't exonerate you of responsibility to educate yourself. Find out what you can biblically allow and teach with confidence, and get out there and do that job for the sake of the church and the world. So it's clear that Francis Chan is sympathetic with the prophetic movement, and that might be putting it mildly. What's not clear is how to be discerning when faced with prophetic claims. And he's admitted that his discernment has been lacking. And in the face of that admission, I think it would be appropriate to say, now, as a Bible teacher with 40 years of ministry under my belt, here's what I think we need to be doing to be more discerning so that we aren't finding out too late whether this prophecy or that prophecy should guide my beliefs, should affect my decision-making, and should be guiding my actions. So that's really the next step I would look for from Francis Chan and from Sam Storms, for example. Look, we didn't exercise sufficient discernment because we didn't apply adequate criteria in the past, and we let a lot of things slide, and, we were bamboozled. And then we went out and we shared our bamboozlement with a church that was trusting us. But now this is what we can say more confidently and more fully and more adequately about how to be discerning. That's what I'm looking for from these people. From the rest of the leadership within the church, the evangelical church, I'm looking for them to just be clear even about what Christians should believe about today's prophetic movement and give very deep biblical insight into this phenomenon that has really been riding the rails through church after church after church that has actually no even affiliation with the charismatic movement or classical Pentecostalism. Why the silence about all that? We need to get better about this. And it may be, I actually think there's logical and philosophical and theological space for views that are continuationist but not charismatic, or continuationist but not Pentecostal. And probably people need to learn what that space looks like, but you're not hearing about it from people who are wanting to be peacemakers and pursue unity, but are leaving others floundering, looking for guidance where they have a responsibility to offer.
Yeah. And so in the letter from the elders, I think, it's clear that just as Francis Chan has exercised a real lack of discernment, the same could be said for these elders. In the letter, they're talking about Chris Reed in the letter. So they do bring up Chris Reed, and they say during the July 2021 gathering, several of us elders personally observed Chris Reed give prophetic words that were highly specific and were hard for us to explain apart from the supernatural. At the moment, we assumed his gift was legitimate. We were also operating largely based on the IHOPKC leadership's endorsement of him. In hindsight, this highlights an unfortunate pattern in a desire to trust and give the benefit of the doubt. We trusted other people's endorsement. So I think they're essentially showing here that they've really exercised a real lack of discernment as well.
Yeah. Well, there's something interesting about that part of the statement by them that deserves, some unpacking. We don't have all the time for, but it is that they seem to imply that because Reed's prophetic words were so specific, they were testable. And that testability assumes, for it to have any teeth, that prophecy should be infallible and not corrigible. It should come true if the prophet is a genuine prophet of God. And so I would like to hear from Francis Chan directly an answer to this question. Do you believe that a person can be a legitimate, authentic prophet of God and yet have a track record of false prophecy? I would like to know from the elders that wrote this letter in support of him, what do you believe about that? Do you believe, and if you don't, if you believe that prophecy can be fallible, then you need to explain how it can be action guiding, why it should make a difference to what we believe. When anytime you open your mouth as a prophet, I should be wondering whether it's actually true and whether it really came from God. So these are some very basic questions, and I would encourage those who have been, even people who've been very helped by Francis Chan's ministry and the ministry of these other people that write this other letter, encourage them to answer these questions too, to your satisfaction. I'd love to hear from you if you've gone to Francis Chan and asked him, do you believe that prophecy can be fallible? And then if you do, how can it be action guiding? How can I know what to believe when I hear it? I would love to know what he would say to that question if it's asked by people who truly do admire his ministry and have been helped by it. Share that with us. Share that in social media. Francis Chan, please share with us what your view is about this. I would encourage the elders to go on record saying what they believe about the fallibility or infallibility of prophecy. But I don't understand why they would be impressed by the details of Chris Reed's prophecy if they didn't think that was a means of testing his authenticity as a prophet. And if it's a means of testing his authenticity as a prophet, that works only on the assumption. It effectively works only on the assumption that prophecy is infallible. But if you believe that, then I think you need to ask, how many people who purport to be prophets are you willing to vouch for with respect to infallibility? How many prophets would you say to be infallible? And I think that many people realize that list would be pretty short at best. And for that reason, they give a little bit too much grounds for people to get things wrong. And this is a point that the prophetic movement needs to answer for, and that pastors of churches, seminaries, professors of seminaries, and so forth need to address specifically so that people can be clear about what the institution stands for, what a particular church or denomination stands for, or whether a person belongs on the mission field if they believe this, that, or, I want to commend those who wrote the letter, the elder letter, for attaching their names to the letter. That's good. That's important accountability. And so I would be looking for those same individuals to have more to say about the things that we've been talking about. When is prophecy to be believed, and can it be fallible? And if so, how can it be action guiding? What should we believe if we know ahead of time that a specific prophet may be mistaken, but we can't tell whether he is until it's almost too late to do anything about it? Those are things I'd like to see people who will put their names on a letter like this, as they have. I'd like to see them address those kinds of concerns.
Doug, I mentioned something earlier, but I want to read this.
Mm-hmm.
As elders, we also looked into criticism surrounding IHOPKC. We read articles, watched videos, and examined the theological concerns raised online. The most common criticisms centered on NAR, New Apostolic Reformation Association, prophetic culture, and specific end times theology. The NAR accusations were directly refuted on IHOPKC's website. As we evaluated these concerns that were publicly available at the time, we did not see anything that warranted breaking the relationship with Mike or IHOP.
I'm not sure about that refutation thing. That's not accurate. They've used the wrong word there. When you refute a proposition, what you do is you demonstrate that it's false. So they didn't do that. They didn't demonstrate. They didn't the IHOP people who said, well, we're not NAR. We're anything but NAR. They were repudiating it. They were denying it, but they didn't refute the accusation because they couldn't. They couldn't show that the accusation was false. And the reason why they couldn't show that it was false is because the accusation was true. And so these elders are mistaken in suggesting that by a simple denial, IHOP had refuted the accusation. And they couldn't know that it was refuted just because someone denied it. They would only know that if they knew what NAR taught and they knew what IHOP taught. And if they knew both of those things, they would know that the denial was false. So I'm afraid they should not have used the word refuted here.
I agree. I was thinking the same thing.
At one point, the elders in this letter do say that they talked to people who had been critical of Mike Bickle to consult with them and see what their concerns were, because they knew that people were raising concerns. Then later down deeper into their letter, they say that before he was to speak at the first One Thing conference with IHOP, Francis Chan asked many well-respected ministry leaders outside the charismatic tradition if they had concerns about him speaking at IHOP's event and sharing the stage with Mike Bickle. Now, I'll come back to that quote and say what is said next in a moment, but I just wanted to pause here and say that's probably a good idea. I mean, I thought that was interesting that they would that Francis Chan would consult with non-charismatic people who might have concerns about Mike Bickle's teaching, just to hear what they were. And then Francis Chan could weigh those, and whether he agreed with their theology or not, he might find some agreement with concerns that he hadn't noticed before, hadn't been aware of. So that's probably a good practice. I've done that with people in different philosophical traditions when doing philosophy or theological or even philosophy of ministry things, is just compare notes. I found it to be very helpful that I consider my view to be much more convincing and much more persuasive if I'm familiar with alternative points of view and have something responsible and compelling to say about those points of view. It's not good to be ignorant of what those are. And your position is very much strengthened if you can say how it is an improvement on an alternative tradition. Anyway, this is something that Francis did, apparently. And it goes on to say that consistently when he did this, Francis heard from people that these would be people outside the charismatic tradition, that though they may disagree with certain points of Mike's theology, they were minor, and that Mike was a man of strong character and deep devotion to Jesus. Now, what I think, if you're going to do this, what you have to do first is actually ask people who sort of have the background on the issues. And that's something that these non-charismatic leaders might have had. They might not have been specialists. They might not have known a lot about NAR teaching firsthand, but they might have read critical evaluations of it and had secondhand knowledge of it. And so they could provide perspective. But if they had done that, then they probably would have had deeper concerns about Mike Bickle's teaching than they did. So this is only to say that people outside the charismatic tradition also have problems with discernment. And they might give someone like Mike Bickle a pass in the way that Francis Chan understood them to be doing, but when they shouldn't have. They should have been more thoughtful and more knowledgeable. And it's probably not a good idea to evaluate someone's ministry if you know that you haven't really examined it closely enough to be a reliable witness about those things. And then by extension, you don't get a lot of benefit if you're Francis Chan and you're asking non-charismatics who don't really know that much about these things for their evaluation. So, you got two levels of disconnect there. So you should probably be looking vigorously for people who seem to have the most knowledge from within a different tradition of what might be mistaken in Mike Bickle's teaching. You want to find out what are the best arguments against it before you know whether those arguments are ultimately good or not. And I think what Francis Chan concluded from his consultation with these people outside the charismatic movement is inadequate because his research, his investigation didn't go far enough. Now, we don't consider ourselves to be outside or inside either the continuationist or the cessationist movement in our evaluation of NAR. And I think that's another reason to turn to sources like our own, because we think that you don't have to be charismatic to be legitimately concerned or cessationist to be legitimately concerned about what Mike Bickle was teaching. And it's unfortunate that that Francis Chan thought that you almost needed to talk to a non-charismatic to have a real critic weigh in on this. You don't. And there are many charismatics. We've interviewed with them. We've talked with them. We don't really say much about the continuationist or cessationist points of view in our critique of NAR because we don't think they're all that relevant, that you should be able to tell that NAR is off the tracks and off the rails, regardless of your view about those things. Francis Chan doesn't seem to understand that, at least in the strategy that he adopts here in consulting critics. It kind of comes across in this letter that the only real critics they were hearing from were people who were outside the charismatic. Maybe they were cessationists, and even they couldn't find fault enough with Mike Bickle. I don't really understand that. Charismatic or not, I don't understand how a well-informed person would not have concerns about what Mike Bickle was teaching. And by extension then, because Sam Storms defended Mike Bickle in his teaching, wouldn't have concerns about Sam Storms' own teaching and now Francis Chan's teaching. So yes, this is an interesting strategy for deciding whether to speak on a platform or not, but it's not really adequate. You do want people that you have reason to believe have done the biggest digging. You want to consult with those people if you want to find out what might be the most compelling reasons not to accept something. So I think that's a fail on that score. And again, I think that too few people within and without, that is inside and outside charismatic churches, really understand the risks of NAR teaching enough to even educate their own people, much less give someone like Francis Chan advice about whether he should speak on their platform.
Well, that's been a great discussion, Doug. That's all I had. Is there anything you wanted to say as we wrap up?
Well, I can imagine that anybody who's had the patience to listen to all that we've been talking about here might wonder, how do you connect the dots, or what does it boil down to most fundamentally? And I think that it comes down to this. Francis Chan spent a lot of time in his ministry promoting people he now realizes he should not have promoted. But he's not told us what criteria he used. I mean, he's alluded to some of it, but More importantly, he hasn't told us what criteria he's going to use in the future. So I don't think anybody can really be sure that next time Francis Chan speaks favorably about a NAR-related minister, someone who, is within the NAR movement, should be trusted. They don't really know that he's using any different criteria tomorrow or even today than he used 10 years ago, because he hasn't told what criteria he used 10 years ago, and he's not telling us what criteria he's using now that are different. I think he should do that. So that's one of the summary points I would make. Another summary point is to realize that one reason why he was so gracious, as he wants people to say, to believe in his support for people within that movement, is that he has sympathy for the prophetic movement himself. And I wonder then what he really believes is true about the movement and what is not on biblical grounds. Or does he believe that we just can't evaluate it biblically? If Francis Chan thinks that we have to evaluate it experientially because we don't have scripture to help us in this, then I think he should make that clear. I would disagree with him if that's what he thinks. If he agrees with me that the Bible does give us guidelines, then let's hear what those are so that we can all be more discerning going forward. That would be my second point. So his sympathy for the prophetic movement is what led him to lower his guard and sort of let anyone who made a kind of promising impression initially, who really proved to be deceptive. Look, the third point here is simply this, that when it comes to prophecy, if you're willing to be deceptive and claim to speak for God as if God told you something, and now others should believe what you're telling them because that's what God said, and you're not telling the truth about that, then you can't be trusted with anything else either. That is one of the most egregious sins you could commit, would be to claim to speak for God and not be speaking for God. That is very serious business. And no one who is capable of that should be trusted for much of anything, frankly. And that's a really critical test of character in itself. So much abuse in the church, so much spiritual abuse occurs when people make authoritative claims and don't support their claims on reasonable grounds that people can trust. That doesn't excuse the rest of us for following in their steps or listening to them. But it's true, and Francis Chan seems to understand this. This would be maybe a fourth summary point. He understands that he has an influence in the world, and he understands that people do believe things that he tells them. And when he says, you can trust this guy, you can go to the bank with this individual who makes prophetic statements and drives an ordinary car because I told you so, he knows that he has an influence with people. And that is a sobering thing. And knowing that going forward, I think, should mean that you make fewer mistakes in the future and you don't say, well, I made mistakes before, I'm going to make them again. I think what you do is you exercise greater caution and you tell us what new criteria you're going to use for doing that. Otherwise, I think people should trust you less than they used to because they don't know what you're doing differently. They only know that you're sorry for what you've done in the past. So that's an important point. Now, a final point I would make would be about the social media stuff. And I already mentioned that these people, all of them are using, and we do too, the new platforms that are provided through social media to help communicate what we believe is true and to build a case for it. If you're going to do that, you can't then accuse the medium of causing all your problems. If you really do think that the medium is part of the problem, then maybe you should absent yourself and not use the medium. I think the crucial thing is to learn how to use it more responsibly and not make claims that you don't want to have to backpedal on sometime in the future. Now, there are things that I might change my mind on, even based on this discussion we're having here, or related to this discussion here. But I don't think I would be embarrassed if later I had to say, I used to think this, but now I think that. That's different. But then endorsing something that it proves to be such a public scandal that, now I have egg on my face for having made ungrounded claims on behalf of someone or something that I believe. So that's the crucial thing. It's not that we shouldn't have to ever make a correction in our course and admit that maybe we were wrong about something before. It's the nature of the mistake that we made and the failure to be responsible, even when we made the mistake, to the right criteria. We're not seeing that in this case. That's a big deal. Social media is a powerful tool. And if we're going to use that tool, we need to understand its tool, just its power, just as it is with music. The people at Bethel Music and at Bethel Church, including Bill Johnson, they know the power of music. And so they exploit that power to try to get people to believe certain things, to behave certain ways, to have certain expectations about God. And people do when they give themselves over to this without criticism and discernment. They are yielding their souls to a powerful influence. And social media, Facebook, podcasting, tools like the ones that we're using here also have tremendous power. And we all have a responsibility to use it in a responsible way. But so do the people who listen, who watch, who take notes, and to think about what they're hearing. We all have a responsibility to be more careful about what words we accept and whether or not we ourselves have itching ears, as the scriptures speak of. And we are favorable towards things we hope are true and wish were true, whether or not we have reason to believe that they're true.
Yeah, and I would say that I would encourage people to be discerning with all teachers, all resources, even with those that you've come to trust. We've observed the shifts in Francis Chan's teaching over the years. He's really put an emphasis on the importance of unity. He has a book called Until Unity. Talks about God's desire for, the church to have unity, which is true. That's clear from scripture, but it has to be a unity that doesn't dispense of truth. And it seems that Francis over the years has been willing to dispense with the truth side of things in order to promote that unity. And he's also always struck me as someone who is led by his feelings and his emotion. And I think that's very attractive to people. I think many people who are drawn to Francis Chan's speaking and his books and everything, they really like that he does tap into that just real passion and zeal and emotion. But it's really important for all of us to continue to be discerning with any teachers, any resources in our studies we use for our church small groups and our, any teaching we're consuming ourselves, and not just come to trust someone as a teacher when we're in camp and, middle school, and then just think they're good, for everything they put out after that, without really being a Berean and continuing to evaluate everything by scripture.
Well, that's true for sure. And the responsibility goes not only to the person who has been invited to speak, but also to the people who invited that person to do the speaking. And so the responsibility goes right up the chain. And, if Francis Chan has a group of elders that he listens to, then they have a responsibility. And maybe they were feeling that a bit as elders within his ministry, that they were somehow implicated by extension because of the things that Francis Chan admitted were mistakes on his part. And really, that is true. And so we all need to be a lot more thoughtful about who we endorse, who we invite, who we approve for leadership, who we send to the mission field, who we allow access to our young people, who leads our worship in our churches, which is a very significant feature of Christian life. We're a little bit too casual, and that might be putting it very mildly, about how careful we are in this. I'm mindful of the fact that if we use the biblical criteria for leadership, then we are on safer ground, and we can also say no to someone who aspires to leadership, even is very gifted, because we have criteria from Scripture, from Paul to Timothy, from Paul to Titus, and so forth, that helps us know what to look for. And we get away from that and we start using the wrong criteria. Someone's very charismatic, has a brilliant smile, has a wonderful testimony or whatever. None of those things are listed by Paul as requirements for leadership. And leaders shouldn't have to parade. I'm thinking, for example, of a book that was written about the supernatural life and miracles by a high-profile Christian leader who spends quite a bit of time early in the book really sort of commending himself for how faithful he's been to ministry and why people should trust him. Whatever a person says in his own defense in that regard is really not particularly relevant. You have to look at the evidence they present in support of their views and know their character. The elders in their letter that we've been discussing here acknowledge that it's very hard to evaluate character from a distance. And I think the lesson there is that we don't do it. We don't assume that an author that we like or a public speaker that we like has the character to support their teaching just because we like their teaching or their presentation style or we find them very convincing. We shouldn't do that. I mean, it's dangerous even for students of professors who have lots of time with them in class and maybe meet with them outside of class and know what they're like in their home sometimes and things like that, to really regard them as exemplary people who could be implicitly trusted. We live in a society where we're largely removed from the transparency of a person's life. There are so many protections that each of us enjoy that protect our privacy and prevent transparency, that it's not really wise for us to just completely entrust ourselves to very many people. It should be a short list, and it should be a very carefully constructed list. So social media only makes that more so. And I think that when the elders make that point, that we're evaluating people's character from a distance, they draw the wrong conclusion if they think we have to do it anyway. We don't. If we don't have access through transparency to the right degree, then we shouldn't be making those judgments. And we often let slip from our lips how much we think this person or that person is very godly or very spirit-filled or clearly led by the Spirit or has special contact with the Spirit of God or is one of God's anointed or one of the great gifts to the church and all this sort of thing. We might be better advised to withhold those kinds of judgments, or at least don't leak them out through through actual words of that sort, and just examine their teaching, see if it's true, as the Bereans did, and then try to live according to the Scriptures and be faithful to that, and try to live and be faithful Christians ourselves. Maybe my last word would be to recall Paul's words to Timothy in his first letter, his first epistle, chapter 4, verse 16, where he says to Timothy, pay close attention to yourself and to your teaching, because as you do this, you will ensure salvation, not only for yourself, but for those who hear you. So it's the character of a person as well as the teaching of a person, the doctrines of a person, that together jointly make them trustworthy people. And that's what we should aspire to, and we should use both in our evaluations. And if distance prevents us from being able to do that, then we shouldn't do it in that case either.
Those are great closing words there, Doug. Thank you for
Thank you,
coming
Holly. I
together with
appreciate
me from your boat on the Everglades and taking this time to talk through these important issues.
Well, you're in Alaska, and I'm in the south end of Florida here, about as far away as I could be from where you are. And yet here we've had this opportunity because of amazing technology to have a good discussion. Thank you for being open to doing that.
Yeah, probably weather-wise too. It looks like it's about -4 right now in where I am. So I imagine it's a lot warmer where you are.
It's a lot warmer than that. It was in the upper 70s here, and I think it'll go on up from there. And also with quite a bit more humidity, or humidity that goes with heat. So yes, we're living in practically different worlds right now.
Okay. Well, thanks, Doug. We'll talk again.
Thank you, Holly.